Olá, bem-vindas e bem-vindos. Eu sou a Mariana Almeida e este é o McKinsey Talks, direto do estúdio da McKinsey em São Paulo. O episódio de hoje vai falar sobre um tema que está tirando o sono de muitos líderes empenhados em sustentabilidade. Como descarbonizar a cadeia de suprimentos. Diminuir a pegada de carbono é cada vez mais uma necessidade competitiva. De um lado, consumidores exigem mais transparência sobre o impacto climático dos bens e serviços que eles adquirem. E do outro, um número crescente de empresas se posiciona diante dos desafios climáticos e assume compromissos para reduzir a pegada de carbono dos seus produtos. Para capturar esta parcela crescente de consumidores, empresas estão investindo em um portfólio de crescimento verde de baixo carbono. Isso envolve 3 rastreamentos de carbono diferentes. O mais fácil é o de escopo 1, com as emissões produzidas diretamente pelas empresas. No escopo 2, estão as emissões por meio da compra de energia. E no escopo 3, estão as emissões mais difíceis de rastrear, pois são geradas por terceiros na cadeia de valor, tanto upstream quanto downstream. E é sobre este último desafio que falaremos hoje. Neste episódio do McKinsey Talks, você vai saber como empresas líderes em diversos setores estão se preparando para provar a baixa intensidade de carbonos de bens e serviços envolvendo toda a cadeia de valor. Para falar sobre esta tendência crescente na área de operações, temos aqui conosco no estúdio, mais uma vez, o Lapo Mori, sócio da McKinsey baseado em Denver, que é também um dos grandes especialistas mundiais em transformações de cadeias de suprimentos. Por isso, a nossa conversa será em inglês. Welcome again, Lapo. It's such a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
E compondo o time de especialistas, temos aqui também, ao meu lado, o Edson Guimarães, sócio associado da McKinsey em São Paulo e líder da prática de supply chain no Brasil. Bem-vindo, Edson, mais uma vez aqui. É um prazer.
Obrigado, Mari. É um prazer estar aqui novamente.
Muito bem. Lapo, we have been seeing carbon become a sort of new currency. It recently crossed the barrier of 100 euros per ton in the European market. Would you tell us what the trend for regulators, industries, and consumers is?
Yes, there has been many and quick changes on this topic. If you look at policy, the landscape is rapidly evolving. And what we are seeing is requirements on much higher transparency. And I would say this is not just creating a demand for transparency, but it's also creating the right to play. Some markets, especially Europe, may become very hard for players who are not providing this information to actually play in. The second one is a shift in customer demand and preferences. We are seeing across sectors that customers are increasingly asking for climate impact transparency, and both for goods and services. And in some cases, this transparency is actually very difficult to track and measure. However, we should always see this one as an opportunity because given that it's difficult to measure, that creates a distance between the leaders that are able to create this transparency and provide it as a service to their customers and those that cannot. And I would say finally, there's increasing pressure from shareholders and stakeholders on companies. We have seen in the last 24 months many commitments on low carbon and climate strategies that are very aggressive. And in order to be able to meet those commitments, companies will need to make this a top priority.
Yes, and I would say that as we said before in one of the episodes, that moving towards digital and advanced analytics is a matter of when, not if. So is sustainability, right? So companies it will be mandatory for them to adapt themselves towards a more having more greener supply chain, I would say.
Yeah, it's an imperative right now. So Edson, in the supply chain and logistics domain, what is the greatest challenge to lower carbon emissions and why is such an important lever? You just said a little bit, but can you deep dive?
No, sure. So if we consider manufacturing companies, 80% of Scope 3 emission accounts for their overall climate impact, right? So this is, as Scope 1 and 2 are important, so is 3. And 30% of the Scope 3, they could be abated by optimizing your operations, your supply chain, as well as procuring low carbon energy suppliers, right? And when we say about optimizing the supply chain, it means reviewing your network, looking for the best footprint, but from a sustainability standpoint as well. You can leverage tools to actually optimize your daily routing, your cargo loading, as well as the mix of transport, right? In Brazil, depending on the industry, this last point of reviewing the mix of transport is more difficult because we have a wide road freight base. Nevertheless, this is also a trend in other countries, right? And I would say that there are also factors that they are more structural, that there is still some uncertainty on how they will unfold over time, but reducing fuel consumption. This is also a major factor of Scope 3 emission. So is looking for electrification of vessels, of trucks, and so on and so forth. So these are some examples of how you could tackle Scope 3 emissions reduction. And I think the last point to say is all these efforts, most of them at least, will be dependent on cross-collaboration in the value chain, downstream and upstream, right? So collaborating with your suppliers, with your clients. But I think it's super important to highlight that it is expected that half of these changes will actually be cost neutral, meaning that it will only require a new way of working, not necessarily being more costly.
And Lapo, how can companies act so to start doing all of this that he mentioned?
We have seen different archetypes on how companies can get into this journey. And those archetypes are dependent on geography, on the sectors they operate in, and also on their size. The first archetype is actually leading the transition alone. So companies, and this is especially viable for large corporations that they have critical mass on their own, to basically start a transformation, and by doing that, pulling with them the rest of their value chain. The second archetype is more collaborative, and we see companies cooperating with their partners in their supply chains to actually move towards this transition to net zero. And finally, there's some players that are actually waiting for others to develop technologies and new way of working, and then expect to adopt it when it's a more advanced level. Again, there's no silver bullet. Sometimes you see also a combination of these three. However, going back to your point, Edson, on Scope 3 emissions, those ones are the hardest, of course, to tackle. And we haven't seen examples of companies being able to do that unless they do it with the whole ecosystem. So collaboration is really critical if you want to go after Scope 3 emissions. And there are many interesting concepts that we see going actually from concept to starting to become reality, like the one on green corridors, where there's full value chains from first steps in the value chain, really procurement of raw materials, all the way to the customers, where all the players in all those steps, and that can be 10 different players, come together, work also with regulators, because of course they have a huge influence on how they can implement these new pathways, and work together to decarbonize the whole end-to-end value chain. Concepts like this one, of course, are more difficult to implement. It takes longer. You have to align many different parties. But we believe these are like going to be the only ones really to enable Scope 3 emissions reduction, significant reduction.
And Lapo, would you say that companies would need to tackle the whole value chain at once to build these green corridors, or they could create steps?
You can work on different elements of the decarbonization in parallel. However, if you really are aiming to get the full value chain to net zero, you actually need to engineer upfront. You need to think, what is my fuel strategy? How my shipping suppliers are going to be upgrading their fleet to be able to take advantage of that? How am I going to be using the vessels on their way back or trucks on their way back to be able to be even more efficient? So you need to, given there are so many players and so many steps in the value chain, you need to think through all these steps on paper and then implement. But the implementation you can definitely do in different steps.
Great.
Okay. So Edson, you already tackled a little bit in my next question, but do you want to deep dive a little bit about the next steps, the first steps that a company has to take to go into this journey? Do you have anything else to add?
I would say, if I can, even though I touched some of the points, I would say that there are 3 steps for make it easier for everyone to fix it, right? So first of all, it's difficult to tackle if you don't measure it, if you don't have a baseline. So this is number 1, right? Companies need to create a carbon accounting foundations to really understand measuring, collecting data, to see how the scope 3 emissions are, right? So that they can start visualizing it, having reports, just as any other, let's say, key performance indicator of the company, right? So this is number 1, baselining, and also identify the value at stake. So how much should I look for optimizing for reduction? And this links to the second point, right? Once I start measuring and having transparency of these CO2 emissions, companies need to think on creating the pathway, what they will do in order to reduce it, right? Breaking down into clear initiatives to be tackled. On the second point, building this pathway and the granular initiatives, you should also define the targets, right? So how much and by when we'll actually aim for reducing scope 3 emissions. And this could be, the timing, I would say, of this roadmap, it may differ between the 3 scopes. Scope 1 and 2, you should have at least a roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years, I would say. Scope 3, as it requires a lot of collaboration beyond the company itself, you can have this pathway towards the next 4 to 8 years, for example, right? And at last, I would say that the third step would be really starting implementing these initiatives, as well as tracking the results of it. And as a final remark, I think we mentioned that before, but it's critical to say that the industry collaboration is going to be also core, meaning that it's not only your company, your suppliers, your clients, but especially scope 3 emission will require also cross-collaboration with potential competitors, because it's an industry foundations change to some extent.
It involves the whole ecosystem.
Absolutely.
Everyone. Okay. So unfortunately, we are reaching the end of our session. So would you have any final remarks, Lapo and Edson?
Look, I would say this is what we have described is a complex journey that companies are embarking. However, it's also a big opportunity because, as I said, everything that is challenging is going to reward whomever can tackle it the fastest and the most effective. And we already see companies that are really creating a growth strategy around decarbonization. We have seen examples across different sectors. For example, JetBlue is the first major US airlines that already in 2019, they offset all domestic passenger flight emissions. And of course, they market it very well to their customers. Oatly, completely different sectors, they have started to add to their packaging information on their emission footprint next to their nutrition levels. So these are like just examples on how companies are using this transformation in the industry to create a new growth for them.
Yes, and I would say that this is every company should start this journey sooner rather than later. You can actually, despite being a very complex and challenging problem, you can start in a simplified way and become more sophisticated over time, right? So just as an example of what I'm saying, even on creating the baseline and your starting point, there are several ways to do that. There are ways that you can estimate your scope 3 emissions in a more high-level manner, and then over time become more sophisticated and actually tracking the actual emission of the supply chain, of the truck, of the railway, of the vessel, and so on and so forth. So I think that to wrap up is really the journey should start sooner rather than later, right now, right? And it starts simple and then evolve. Because what we see many times, the same that I mentioned before on digital and advanced analytics, is paralysis of the companies, right? They wait until have the perfect environment to start, and that may never happen. So this is, I would say, my final remark for this sustainability journey in supply chain.
And if you wait too much, you're going to be left behind. So
for sure.
Okay. So thank you very much, Lapo and Edson. It was, again, a great conversation.
Thank you.
Muito obrigada também a você que nos acompanha em vídeo ou em podcast. Para entrar em contato com os nossos especialistas ou nos enviar perguntas, o nosso e-mail é mckinsey-talks@mckinsey.com. E a nossa agenda completa está lá no mckinseytalks.com. Você também pode conferir este episódio e os anteriores ali em vídeo ou em podcast. E se você gosta do McKinsey Talks, compartilhe este episódio com seus amigos e colegas. É isso aí, muito obrigada e até a próxima!